I walked into my parents' kitchen and froze. My 6-year-old daughter was trembling at the sink scrubbing a heavy pot, while my father towered over her, yelling like she was a grown-up who had failed him. That moment broke something inside me. This isn't just a story about parenting or disrespect. It's about the line you draw when enough is enough and the courage it takes to protect your child from the people who raised you. If you've ever felt like you were reliving your childhood pain through your own kids, stay with me. This story might help you find your voice too. My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 35 years old and a single mother to Emma, my spirited and imaginative 6-year-old daughter. I live in a modest yet cozy 2-bedroom apartment nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside Seattle. Here, tree-lined streets and small family-owned cafes create a comforting backdrop, a stark contrast to my hectic daily routine. My mornings start early, usually before the sky shifts from dark navy to the first faint streaks of dawn. In those quiet moments before the world awakens, I savor the brief stillness, sipping my coffee and mentally preparing myself for the day ahead. Each day demands precise planning, leaving little margin for error. It's not easy balancing my demanding career as a financial consultant and raising a young child on my own, but somehow I've made it work. At precisely 6:45, I tiptoe into Emma's room, gently brushing strands of curly brown hair away from her peaceful sleeping face. Her room is a vibrant space decorated with her favorite books, colorful drawings, and an assortment of beloved stuffed animals. When I softly call her name, she stirs, blinking sleepily, and breaks into a warm, wide-eyed smile that never fails to melt my heart. Our mornings together are special, a quiet haven amid the rush. Emma and I share breakfast at the small wooden table by our kitchen window. Her favorite meals alternate between fluffy strawberry pancakes topped with maple syrup, scrambled eggs with cheddar cheese, or blueberry oatmeal, each made lovingly by hand. As we eat, she chatters excitedly about what her day might hold, whether it's a planned art project at school or the possibility of finally conquering the monkey bars on the playground. After breakfast, I help Emma get ready for school, meticulously packing her pink backpack with all the necessities. A well-loved stuffed bunny for comfort, homemade snacks, and her homework neatly placed inside. She skips cheerfully toward our apartment door, full of anticipation and wonder, holding my hand tightly as we descend the stairs and head out into the brisk morning air. Emma's elementary school sits only a short distance from our apartment, allowing me to walk her there each morning. At the school's entrance, amidst the joyful chaos of parents and children bidding farewell, I kneel down to hug her tightly. She wraps her small arms around my neck and whispers, "I love you, Mommy," before darting into the building, her laughter echoing behind her. I stand briefly waving until she disappears inside, savoring this fleeting moment of maternal joy before diving into my workday. After dropping Emma off, I shift gears swiftly, entering my role as a financial consultant at a prominent firm downtown. My days are demanding and structured, filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless streams of numbers. Yet my professional life provides a sense of control and fulfillment. I've always been meticulous and driven, traits that have carried me to a position of stability and respect in my career. Qualities I'd hoped would finally earn recognition from my family. Yet despite my professional success, there's always been one area where validation and acknowledgement have felt eternally out of reach. My relationship with my parents, John and Linda Bennett. Growing up, my family life was marked by subtle yet persistent favoritism. I was their firstborn, responsible, dependable, and driven. My younger sister Allison, born 2 years later, was everything I felt I wasn't. Charming, effortlessly outgoing, and the unquestionable center of our parents' universe. From childhood, Allison captured their attention and praise with every small success. Whether it was winning a minor beauty contest or earning third place in a local talent show, her every step was celebrated openly. Meanwhile, my significant achievements, top grades, winning academic competitions, or landing prestigious internships, barely garnered a mention. The differences between us became painfully clear at every family event. I still vividly remember my high school graduation day. I stood proudly delivering my valedictorian speech, only to see my parents huddled enthusiastically around Allison, afterwards celebrating her cheerleading performance at a minor local competition the same weekend. In those moments, I learned to swallow my disappointment and keep my emotions concealed, nurturing an invisible yet persistent ache deep within. When financial hardship struck my parents 3 years ago, threatening the home where Allison and I grew up, a charming, picturesque house with white shutters and flowering azaleas in a quiet suburb. I saw an opportunity. Perhaps I thought if I could help them through this crisis, they might finally recognize my value, appreciate my efforts, and see me in the same light they saw Allison. Without hesitation, I quietly stepped in to shoulder their financial burden. Each month, without fanfare, I transferred $2,000 from my account directly to their mortgage lender, ensuring they could stay comfortably in their beloved home. Over 3 years, this amounted to over $70,000, a significant financial sacrifice I willingly undertook, hoping for nothing more than genuine appreciation or acknowledgement. Yet despite my silent contributions, the familial dynamic remained stubbornly unchanged. Allison, now a mother herself, continued to occupy the spotlight. Despite her unstable financial decisions and frequent pleas for assistance, my parents never questioned her choices, always ready with excuses or understanding. I meanwhile remained their reliable fallback, the quiet presence who kept the family afloat, but never seemed to earn a meaningful seat at their table. Deep down, I often questioned my motivations. Why was I consistently sacrificing my own comfort time and resources for people who seemingly failed to recognize my worth? Perhaps I was driven by an ingrained belief from childhood that love and respect must always be earned through sacrifice and silent perseverance. Perhaps I clung to the hope, however faint, that one day they might finally notice me, the daughter who quietly kept their dreams and stability intact. Yet lately, as Emma grew older, I began seeing reflections of my younger self in her eyes, hopeful, trusting, and vulnerable. It sparked a new determination within me. More than anything, I wanted Emma's life to be different. I wanted her childhood defined by unconditional love and unwavering support, not shadowed by subtle neglect or favor. Little did I know how soon my carefully constructed world would be tested. A seemingly ordinary day would soon shatter the fragile peace I'd maintained, forcing me to confront truths I'd long buried. It would take only one shocking, unanticipated moment for me to realize that seeking validation from my parents was futile. That real strength lay not in silent sacrifice, but in bold protective action for the person who mattered most, my daughter Emma. That defining moment, heartbreaking yet crucial, was swiftly approaching, and with it a transformative journey that would forever alter our lives. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon, but an unexpected gap in my schedule allowed me to leave work earlier than usual. A meeting with an important client had wrapped up swiftly, giving me the rare chance to pick up Emma earlier from my parents' home. As I navigated my way through the familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood, memories inevitably resurfaced, yet today they felt distant, as if seen through cloudy glass. I'd often rationalized leaving Emma with my parents twice a week, convincing myself that despite our complicated past, they would treat their granddaughter differently, better, kinder, and fairer. Pulling up to the curb outside their charming white house with blue shutters, I saw Allison's sleek black SUV parked carelessly across the driveway, a sight that made my stomach twist slightly. My younger sister's visits always carried an undertone of drama, subtle reminders of childhood rivalries and old grievances I longed to leave behind. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and approached the house, my heels clicking softly against the front steps. The door was slightly ajar, a habit of my parents that I'd always warned them against given the neighborhood's changing safety conditions. As I entered the foyer, quietly intending to surprise Emma, the familiar warmth of my childhood home enveloped me. Yet something immediately felt off. From somewhere deeper within the house, the muffled sound of voices drifted toward me, sharp, raised, and edged with unmistakable anger. Pausing briefly, I strained to listen, my heart quickening as I recognized my father's harsh, booming voice. "No, not like that, can't you do anything right?" my father barked. I froze. His tone was harsher than I'd ever imagined he'd use toward Emma. Uncertainty tightened my chest as I moved quietly but swiftly down the hallway toward the kitchen, drawn forward by rising anxiety and the protective instinct only a mother knows. When I reached the doorway, the scene before me brought every muscle in my body to a sudden, painful halt. Emma stood at the sink on a small, unstable wooden stool, clearly struggling with an oversized, heavy pot far too cumbersome for her little hands. Soap bubbles clung to her trembling fingers, and water splashed across the countertop and onto her clothes, making dark, wet stains on her pastel pink dress. My father towered over her, his face red and twisted in exasperation, pointing aggressively at the dish in her hands. Beside him, my mother stood passive, her arms crossed, watching without intervention, a mild expression of annoyance rather than concern on her face. Across the kitchen, Allison lounged casually at the table, flipping through her phone with studied indifference. Her daughters, Sophie and Lily, seated comfortably nearby, watched Emma and giggled conspiratorially, whispering insults loud enough for Emma to hear. "Look at her. So clumsy," Sophie sneered, smirking openly at Lily. "Useless, just like her mom," Lily echoed, laughing softly into her hand. My pulse quickened. The cruelty of their words felt like icy fingers gripping my heart, pulling me back into my own childhood, a time marked by the very same dismissive and cutting remarks. I knew this hurt intimately, yet seeing Emma endure it was infinitely worse. Emma's small shoulders shook with barely suppressed tears as she wiped her eyes furtively, with a wet sleeve, desperate not to reveal how deeply the words cut. Her tiny voice, barely audible, trembled as she pleaded, "Grandpa, it's so heavy. I'm trying my best." My father scoffed harshly, unfazed. "Life doesn't get easier just because you cry about it. Maybe if your mother wasn't so busy working all the time, you'd actually know how to do simple things." The venomous remark sent a jolt of anger through me. The hypocrisy stung. I had financially supported them quietly, month after month, yet they still dared to belittle me, even using Emma as the target of their bitterness. I saw myself clearly in my daughter's suffering, a mirror to my own past, suddenly and painfully real. My years of quiet endurance suddenly seemed meaningless and misguided. Every justification I'd made for leaving Emma in their care collapsed beneath the weight of this bitter moment. Emma's bottom lip quivered visibly now, a tear slipping down her cheek as she struggled again to lift the heavy pot, desperation etched clearly in her small features. In that instant, something within me snapped. A fierce protective instinct surged through my veins, overwhelming any lingering hesitation. I had allowed far too much for far too long, and this was where it would end. Stepping forward abruptly, I entered the kitchen fully, my voice clear and unwavering, shattering the suffocating tension. "Emma, put that down right now." All heads swiveled sharply in my direction, a startled silence engulfing the room. My father looked momentarily stunned, before swiftly masking it with defiance. My mother's eyes widened, Allison sat up abruptly, and my nieces exchanged guilty glances. Emma's face lit up with relief and longing as she saw me standing in the doorway. "Mommy!" she exclaimed, her voice cracking as she clumsily descended the stool and ran to me, her small frame trembling as she wrapped her wet arms tightly around my legs. My father stepped forward defensively. "Sarah, we're teaching her responsibility, something you clearly haven't." I met his glare, steadily refusing to waver. "Responsibility." My voice carried a steel edge I'd rarely employed before. "This isn't responsibility, it's cruelty. She's 6 years old, Dad. She shouldn't be lifting pots nearly as heavy as she is, and she certainly doesn't deserve to be called useless." My mother interjected, her voice cold and detached. "Don't overreact, Sarah. You're too sensitive." "No, Mom," I responded firmly, my resolve unwavering. "I won't let Emma experience what I did. This ends now." In that moment, the dynamic in the room shifted irrevocably. The timid, approval-seeking girl I had once been vanished, replaced by a fierce, unyielding mother determined to protect her child at any cost. Taking Emma's trembling hand firmly in mine, I turned toward the door, feeling lighter despite the heaviness of the confrontation. As I led Emma away, I realized something crucial had changed. A line had finally been drawn, a boundary set in place, marking the beginning of a journey toward healing and empowerment, not only for Emma, but for myself as well. Stepping outside into the fresh air, I breathed deeply, holding Emma close as we moved toward the car. Though the immediate pain of betrayal lingered, clarity filled my thoughts. For the first time, I knew exactly what needed to be done next, and I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The drive home that evening was filled with a silence so dense it almost hurt. I could hear the faint hum of the engine, the rhythmic swish of the wipers brushing away a light drizzle, and Emma's soft breathing behind me. But there were no questions from her, no songs sung quietly under her breath, no chatter about school or silly stories about her classmates, just silence. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her tiny frame was curled against the window, her cheek resting on one palm, eyes wide but unfocused. There was something about the stillness in her that broke me, like I was watching the beginning of a shadow being cast over her light. "Sweetheart," I said gently, my voice cautious as though afraid to disturb something fragile. "What happened back there? None of it was your fault. Do you hear me?" Her eyes met mine in the mirror. She didn't respond. I pushed a little further. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were doing your best, and that's all anyone should ever ask of you." "But I dropped the pot," she said softly after a moment. "And Grandpa said I make excuses, just like you." That last part twisted something in my chest. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Emma, listen to me carefully," I said, slowing the car as we turned onto our street. "Grown-ups aren't always right even when they think they are. That pot was way too heavy. It never should have been your job, and no one has the right to make you feel small for asking for help." Still, she said nothing, but the way her shoulders slumped told me she'd been holding in a weight too heavy for someone her age. When we got home, I unbuckled her seatbelt and carried her up the stairs, pressing her close. Her small hands clung to the fabric of my coat, and she buried her face into my neck. She smelled of dish soap and something sour. Shame, maybe. I kissed her forehead as we stepped into the apartment, the familiar warmth offering a kind of quiet reassurance. I ran a bath pouring in lavender-scented bubbles and helped her out of her clothes, trying to be as gentle as I could. Her arms had red marks where the hot water had clearly been too much. My stomach turned. "Does this hurt?" I asked softly as I dabbed them dry. She shook her head, but her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay to cry," I told her, hugging her tightly. "You don't have to be brave for me." After her bath, I wrapped her in her favorite fleece pajamas, the ones with the penguins, and tucked her into the couch with a warm blanket and a mug of cocoa. She didn't want to talk, but she clutched my hand while I read her 3 picture books, her thumb rubbing circles against my knuckle like she needed to feel I was real. I stayed with her until her eyes closed and her breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did I get up and retreat to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of red wine, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The numbers on the banking app blurred together. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. $2,000 every month for 3 years. I scrolled through the transaction history. 63 payments, on time, unquestioned, automatic. I had kept my parents in that house. The house I had never truly felt welcome in. The house where I was always second to Allison. Always the practical one, the invisible one, the one who brought results but never joy, who achieved but never shined, who gave but was never given to. I thought helping them financially might finally tip the scale, that they'd look at me the way they looked at her, with admiration, with pride, with softness. But no. Even after 3 years of paying their mortgage, I was still the daughter whose child was forced to scrub dishes while being called useless. I had paid for their roof, and still they couldn't even provide Emma shelter from their cruelty. My hand hovered over the cancel button on the transfer setup. The screen asked, "Are you sure you want to stop this recurring payment?" I clicked, "Yes." My chest exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for years. I wasn't just canceling a payment, I was ending a cycle. Next, I opened a new savings account under Emma's name. I rerouted the exact amount, $2,000, to a college savings fund. Every cent that once went to silence and dysfunction would now go to her future, her safety, her dreams. Then, as if something inside me had aligned, I called my financial advisor, Craig. "Elaine," he answered groggily. It was late. "Sorry for the hour," I said, "but I need to make a change. A big one." "Everything okay?" "It will be." I took a breath. "I want to start a trust fund for Emma, one my parents can't touch, and I want to increase her college savings. Every month. No exceptions." There was a pause. Then Craig said, "Understood. I'll send you the paperwork first thing tomorrow. I hung up and stared at the ceiling, letting the stillness wash over me. The apartment was silent, but not in the heavy, fearful way it had been before. This was a quiet of clarity, of boundaries, of love refocused. I walked to Emma's room, peeked in. She was sound asleep, her hair spread out across the pillow like a fan of curls. I brushed a strand behind her ear and whispered, "I've got you, baby. Always." As I closed her door behind me, I felt something lift. Shame, obligation, guilt, all of it. The leash had snapped. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt free. The next morning, my phone buzzed non-stop before the sun even rose. 7 missed calls, 12 text messages, all from my parents. Some were written in all caps, some short and venomous, others dripping with confusion. Payment declined. What happened? Call us immediately. Your mother is beside herself with worry. Don't play games with your family, Sarah. You owe us an explanation. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to explain myself to people who only seemed concerned when the money stopped. Instead, I focused on packing Emma's lunch and getting her ready for school. She was still a little withdrawn, but the deep sadness in her eyes had softened overnight. When I kissed her goodbye at the school gate, she clung to my neck for a beat longer than usual. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered. "I love you more," I replied, holding her just tight enough to make her feel anchored. "You're brave and strong and so, so loved." At work, I went through the motions of meetings and spreadsheets, but my mind was miles away. During lunch, I stepped outside and called Natalie, my oldest and closest friend. She was the only person who truly understood the twisted web of my family dynamics. When she picked up, I barely said hello before everything came spilling out. The kitchen scene, the canceled payments, the texts, the silence that had replaced my guilt. "You did the right thing," Natalie said without hesitation. "You set a boundary, and it wasn't too late. That's everything." I let her words settle. I wanted to believe her, but I still felt the familiar tug of responsibility in my gut. That mortgage. I've been paying it for years. It was never supposed to be permanent. But they made it permanent. No, Sarah. They expected it to be permanent. That's not the same thing. You offered help. They turned it into a lifeline and tied it around your neck. Her voice was firm, and for the first time I didn't flinch at the truth. That evening after dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time a new message from Allison. "I can't believe you'd do this to Mom and Dad." "Over what?" "One little argument with Emma. You're being selfish. They're your parents." I stared at the message, shaking my head. One little argument. She had heard it. She had been there. Her daughters had joined in. I took a breath and typed out a response. "My financial arrangements with Mom and Dad are no one's business but mine. And if your daughters ever speak to mine that way again, you'll be cut off. Not financially, but from our lives completely." She never replied. I was still staring at the screen when my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Moments later, a notification popped up. "This is First State Bank. We're calling to verify suspicious activity on your account." My stomach dropped. I called them back immediately. A polite but serious voice explained that someone claiming to be my father had attempted to access my personal account information, stating he had authorization as a joint household member. Of course he didn't. My account was solely in my name. The attempt had been flagged and blocked, but my heart raced as I listened. He'd tried to get to my money. That was the moment I stopped feeling conflicted. All of the self-doubt that had whispered through me since yesterday vanished. There was no misunderstanding. There was no goodwill. My parents had come to rely on me, not out of gratitude but out of entitlement. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource. I hung up and immediately changed every password, updated every security question, and froze any old access points they might have used when I'd helped set up their online bills. And then I cried. Not just from anger but from grief. Grief for the childhood I never had. Grief for the daughter they never truly saw. Grief for the fact that Emma had almost become the next in a line of Bennett women to be quietly hurt in the name of family. I scheduled a meeting with Dr. Annie Carter, Emma's pediatrician, and asked for a referral to a child psychologist. I needed to know, honestly, what kind of damage had been done. I needed to understand the full picture, not just the pieces I'd seen. A week later, after 2 sessions with a specialist, I sat across from Dr. Lucy Raymond, a soft-spoken therapist with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Emma is showing signs of anxiety, she explained carefully. Specifically around perfectionism and fear of adult disapproval. She's been internalizing blame for things that are far beyond her responsibility. My throat tightened. Can we undo it? You caught it early, she said with a reassuring nod. Children are resilient. With continued support and without the source of the stress, she can absolutely recover. Without the source. The message was clear. My parents couldn't be part of Emma's life, not as they were now. I stepped out of the clinic that day into a crisp autumn breeze. The wind tugged at my coat and I pulled it tighter around me as I walked toward the car. I wasn't just breaking ties. I was breaking patterns. The emotional abuse, the favoritism, the subtle manipulations disguised as discipline, those cycles ended with me. Emma would never have to earn love through obedience. She would never confuse conditional praise for affection. She would grow up knowing that her voice mattered, that her feelings were valid, that her mother would always choose her. I started the car and drove away from the clinic with a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something close. It was the beginning of freedom. It started with a knock, then another, followed by my father's voice low and stern through the hallway door. "Sarah, we need to talk." I had just finished folding Emma's laundry. She was in her room humming softly, lining up her stuffed animals for a tea party. I moved silently to the door and looked through the peephole. My parents stood side by side, coats pulled tight against the wind, their faces etched with lines I hadn't noticed before. They looked older, tired, but my sympathy no longer outran my caution. "I'm not opening the door," I said clearly, my voice firm but calm. "This is not the time or the place." "Don't be ridiculous," my mother snapped. "We are your parents." "I agree," I said. "And when you're ready to talk with respect in a neutral setting with a family therapist present, I'll listen. Until then, please leave. If you don't, I'll have to call building security." My father's voice rose sharply. "You'd call security on your own family. I'd call security to protect my child's peace of mind. You should go." They didn't leave immediately. I stood behind the locked door and listened to the shuffle of shoes, the grumbling, the disbelief. Then silence. And then footsteps fading down the hall. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, my heartbeat steady but heavy. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with a name I hadn't seen in years. Rachel Green, my mother's sister, my aunt. I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Aunt Rachel." "Sarah, honey." Her voice was warmer than I remembered, laced with concern. "I just spoke to your mother. She said, she said you've cut them off completely. That it has something to do with Emma." I swallowed. "Yes, it does. And I can explain. But only if you're open to hearing the full story." She listened. For nearly 20 minutes, I recounted what had happened. My father's shouting, Emma's tears, the financial dependency, the emotional manipulation. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. "I believe you," she said softly. "And I'm sorry." Tears stung the corners of my eyes. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words. "I've seen it," she continued. "I saw it when you were little. Your mother always treated you like you were somehow less, like your success was inconvenient, like love was something to be rationed." She sighed. "And she did the same to me when we were growing up. I was the rebellious sister. She was the golden girl. She learned how to wield control by being perfect, and I got tired of being punished for breathing too loudly. Her honesty floored me. You knew I knew. But I didn't think it was my place to interfere. I see now that I should have, and I'm sorry I didn't." I sat down at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the rim of my coffee mug. "They spent everything they had, didn't they?" "They did," she said. "Your grandfather left them a small inheritance. Not millions, but enough to retire modestly. They blew through it in less than 5 years, always spending above their means assuming someone would save them. And I was next in line. You were, she confirmed gently. But you don't have to be. That night I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. It was the first time I felt like someone from that side of the family truly saw me. A week later it came. The foreclosure notice. They didn't tell me directly, of course. They sent a mass email to cousins, aunts, uncles, even distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. The subject line read, "Sarah has abandoned her family." The message was long and full of half-truths and manipulation. It painted me as cruel, ungrateful, heartless. It claimed I had turned Emma against them and ruined their stability out of revenge. At first I felt the shame rise in my throat, familiar and suffocating. But then something unexpected happened. People responded. Not with blame, but with support. My cousin Margaret replied to all I remember how differently they treated you, Sarah. You were always the one left out. I'm sorry I didn't speak up then. An uncle I barely knew sent me a private message. Your father humiliated you in front of us more than once. You're doing the right thing. Even my mother's older sister, whom I'd only met once at a wedding, wrote, "They've always relied on others to fix their messes. Stand your ground." It was as if a wall had broken. The narrative my parents had tightly controlled for decades was unraveling, and for the first time the truth had room to breathe. Later that evening, Emma came into the living room as I was reading. "Mommy," she asked, "is Grandma still mad at me?" I put down the book and pulled her into my lap. "No, sweetheart. Grandma's learning how to be kinder, and we're giving her space to do that. Like a timeout." I smiled. Exactly like a timeout. Even adults need those sometimes. She nodded solemnly, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm glad we came home." "So am I whispered into her hair. In that moment, I realized the full scope of what had changed, not just between me and my parents, but inside me. I no longer felt like a frightened child seeking approval. I was a mother protecting her own, and I had finally found my voice, and this time I wasn't giving it back. Emma's third session with Dr. Lucy Raymond ended with a quiet smile. "She's responding incredibly well," Dr. Raymond told me as we sat in the hallway outside her office. "There's still some lingering anxiety around making mistakes, but her confidence is slowly returning. She feels safer. Safe." It was a word that held so much weight for me, and hearing it applied to my daughter's emotional world made my chest loosen in a way I hadn't realized it had been tight for years. She asked if she could bring a book next time, the doctor added, smiling, "Something she wants to read out loud." That nearly brought me to tears. For weeks, Emma had been too afraid to read in front of adults ever since my father mocked her for stumbling over the word metropolitan. But now she wanted to try again, to share, to be seen. I thanked the doctor and walked Emma out into the chilly air, holding her hand just a little tighter than usual. "Can we go get a cookie?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. "Absolutely," I said. "Let's get two." A month passed in a kind of quiet repair. Emma laughed more. She asked more questions. She stopped saying I'm sorry for every little thing, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were building something better, not just avoiding something worse. Then one Sunday morning, I received an email from my parents. "Subject: we want to talk." It was short, measured, more restrained than their previous attempts. "We'd like to speak with you in person. We understand your conditions. If you're open to it, we're willing to meet with a therapist. Please let us know." I stared at it for a long time. I'd spent years being afraid of disappointing them, of being cast as the ungrateful one. But now they were coming to me, not with demands, but with what almost looked like willingness. I replied later that evening. "We can meet at Dr. Raymond's office. She'll act as a neutral facilitator. Emma will not be present. If this is acceptable, I'll confirm the time." The next morning, they agreed. The therapy office was quiet and warm, with soft chairs arranged in a circle and a diffuser humming lavender into the air. My parents arrived on time. My mother looked nervous, my father rigid. "Dr. Raymond began calmly. "We're here to have an honest, respectful discussion. Everyone will have time to speak. The goal is clarity, not conflict." I nodded. So did they. though my father's jaw was tight. "I'll begin," I said. "This meeting is not about the past. It's about the future. If you want a relationship with Emma, certain things have to change." They didn't interrupt, and I continued. "First, you'll need to attend therapy sessions on your own to understand how your behaviors have impacted your relationships." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. "Second, there can be no more favoritism. Emma must be treated with the same kindness and respect as any other grandchild." At that, my father scoffed. "We always treated them fairly." "Doctor," Raymond raised her hand gently. "We'll let Sarah finish." "Third," I went on, "you need to respect my parenting. No undermining, no discipline outside my guidance, no comparisons. And fourth," I said, leveling my voice, "if there is to be contact with Emma, it will be limited, supervised, and gradual, based entirely on the progress made through therapy." There was a long silence. My mother looked away. My father leaned back, arms crossed, the ticking of the office clock loud in the stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "So you're making us prove ourselves, like criminals?" "No," I said. "I'm asking you to grow, like adults." "Doctor," Raymond leaned in slightly. "Richard, this isn't punishment. It's a boundary. One built to protect a child, your granddaughter." My mother finally spoke. "We didn't mean to hurt her. We thought she needed structure. What she needed was love," I replied gently. "Not structure disguised as shame." She blinked rapidly. "I didn't know how much it affected her." "You do now." Another silence. Then my father said, "We can't afford therapy." I took a breath, prepared. "I'm no longer paying your mortgage," I said. "That decision is final. But if you're serious about making changes, I'm happy to recommend a financial advisor. You need to learn how to live within your means." He looked as if I'd slapped him. "This house, it's our life. It's also a weight you can't carry anymore. And clinging to it is costing you more than money. It's costing you us." For the first time, his face softened. Not in defeat, but in something closer to understanding. My mother sighed. We'll think about it." "Doctor." Raymond nodded. "That's a good start." The meeting ended with no hugs, no promises, just a shared calendar invite for next week's session. But that was more than I'd ever hoped for. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, I sat on the couch in the dark, the hum of the fridge in the background. I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I had drawn a line. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in love. Love for my daughter. Love for myself. Even in some strange way, love for the possibility that my parents might change, if given the chance and the right tools. The healing wouldn't be immediate. It might not even be complete. But the door was open. Just a crack. And this time it would stay that way, only if they earned it. 2 weeks after our therapy session, I received another email from my parents. It was short and to the point. Uncharacteristically so. "We've started individual therapy. Weekly. Doctor. Bennett recommended someone, and we've kept our appointments." There was no guilt tripping, no complaints, no hints of financial distress or reminders of the past. Just a quiet declaration of progress. I sat with the email for a full day before responding. "Thank you for letting me know. I'm glad you're taking this seriously. Please keep me updated." That was it. I didn't offer a visit. I didn't offer praise. But I didn't close the door either. And somehow I knew they understood the difference. Over the next 3 weeks, the updates continued. Slow, steady, and without emotional hooks. They shared that therapy had been harder than expected and that certain memories had surfaced. My mother even mentioned that she was beginning to recognize some of her behaviors not as discipline, but as patterns she had learned and never questioned. By the end of the month, they asked for something new, a short supervised visit with Emma. "We'd like to see her," my mother wrote, "but only if you think she's ready." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I asked Emma first. We were having pancakes on a Saturday morning, and she was picking the blueberries out one by one, arranging them into a smiley face on her plate. "Sweetheart," I said gently, Grandma and Grandpa are trying to be kinder. They're learning how to do better. She looked up at me with those steady eyes. Are they still mad at me? No, baby. They were never really mad at you. They just didn't know how to treat people the right way. But they're working on it now. She thought for a long time, then shrugged. Maybe, if it's short. And outside. Can I bring my book? I smiled. You can bring 3. We met at the park near our apartment late on a Sunday afternoon. It was a quiet spot tucked between rows of maple trees, with a bench that overlooked a small pond. The sky was a soft gray, and a few leaves had started to turn. I saw them before Emma did. My father wore a navy sweater and held something under his arm. My mother stood next to him, clasping her hands tightly. They looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was humility. Emma hesitated when she saw them, her fingers tightening around mine. Do I have to talk a lot? She whispered. No, I said. Just be yourself. And if you want to leave, we leave. She nodded and walked beside me. When we approached, my parents both offered cautious smiles. They didn't reach out. They didn't overwhelm her. They simply stood there waiting. Hi, Emma, my mother said softly. We're really happy to see you. Emma didn't say anything right away. Then she glanced at the package under my father's arm. What's that? She asked. My father cleared his throat. It's a book. About animals in the rainforest. I thought you might like it. I remember you said once that frogs were your favorite. Emma blinked. Then, curiously, she reached for it. Thanks, she said barely above a whisper. We sat together on the bench. I stayed close to Emma. My parents didn't press, didn't prod. They simply talked about the ducks on the pond and asked Emma if she liked school this year. She answered with short, clipped phrases. It's okay. My teacher's nice. I like reading more now. There was a long pause when she dropped the book by accident and flinched. But my father didn't react. He picked it up slowly, handed it back, and said, Only, books are slippery. Happens to me all the time. That small moment felt bigger than anything else. After 30 minutes, Emma tugged on my sleeve. I'm ready to go. I nodded. We stood. Then to my surprise, Emma turned to my mother and gave her a quick hug. Not tight, not long, but intentional. Thank you for the book, she said. My mother's eyes filled with tears. I'm glad you liked it, honey. I hope we can read it together sometime. Emma didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. We walked back to the car in silence. As I buckled Emma into her seat, I asked, How are you feeling? She thought about it. Weird, she said, but not bad. That night after she went to bed, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in months. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was something, a beginning. For so long I had equated boundaries with distance, with loss. But that visit taught me that boundaries can also make space, for reflection, for repair, even for love, when love has learned how to show up properly. I didn't know if we'd ever be a family the way I once imagined. But I did know that this version, the one built on truth and healing and cautious hope, was more real than any performance we'd given for holidays past. It wasn't perfect, but maybe it was enough. 3 months had passed since the first park visit. What surprised me most wasn't the slow thawing of old resentments. It was how easily a new rhythm took shape once boundaries held firm. My parents continued their individual therapy sessions. Dr. Bennett kept me informed, never betraying their privacy, but noting that both had made sincere efforts. My father especially was slowly unlearning his default defensiveness. My mother, who had long hidden behind martyrdom, had begun naming emotions aloud: guilt, regret, fear. Meanwhile, Emma remained cautious but open. Every other week we'd meet at the same park or sometimes at our apartment for a short visit. Always supervised. Always on Emma's terms. She didn't rush into hugs or linger in conversation, but she no longer looked over her shoulder when they arrived. She no longer clutched my hand too tightly when they spoke. And sometimes, just sometimes, she smiled first. One afternoon in early spring, we met at a small cafe that had a little patio and a basket of crayons for children. Emma was coloring a lion in a jungle scene when she accidentally knocked her juice onto the table. The cup tipped, spilling a bright splash of orange across her drawing. Her whole body stiffened. Her hands froze in midair, her eyes wide, tracking my father's expression. I caught it, that flicker of fear. But my father didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table or let out a groan of frustration. Instead, he slowly reached for the stack of napkins and said in a voice so gentle it barely felt like his, "That happens sometimes. Let's fix it together." Emma blinked. "It's okay," she whispered. He nodded. "Of course it is." She nodded slowly, watching him mop up the spill. That one moment undid 100 others. Later that night, while brushing her teeth, Emma said, "Grandpa didn't get mad today." "No, he didn't." I said, sitting on the edge of the bathtub. "How did that make you feel?" She paused, then said, "Like maybe he listens now." It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. I had worried for so long that repairing anything with my parents would mean falling back into old roles. Me the provider, them the entitled recipients. But that wasn't happening. Not this time. Our relationship now was no longer built on money or obligation. It was built on choice, on willingness, on clarity. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting, I was leading. And I wasn't leading with resentment. I was leading with boundaries and truth. The biggest surprise, however, came from Allison. We hadn't spoken much beyond surface-level exchanges in years. But one afternoon, after another weekend playdate between our daughters, she asked if I had time for coffee. Just the two of us. We met at a quiet bookstore cafe tucked between a plant shop and a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and childhood. She arrived on time, holding her phone like a shield. But once we sat down, she put it away. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, stirring her drink. "About how we grew up. About what I used to believe." I said nothing, letting her fill the space. "I thought I was the lucky one," she continued. "I thought getting the bike, the praise, the attention. It meant I was loved more. But I didn't realize how little was expected of me. I wasn't challenged. I wasn't taught how to handle things on my own. Mom and Dad handled everything for me until they couldn't anymore." She looked up. "And now I don't always know what I'm doing as a parent." That admission, so vulnerable, so raw, broke something open between us. "I always thought you were complicit," I said honestly. "Like you enjoyed being the favorite." "I did," she said without flinching. "But I didn't know the cost. Not until I saw how they treated Emma." For a long moment we just sat there. Then I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "There's still time to do it differently," I said. And she nodded. The shift wasn't just between us. It extended to our children, too. On their next playdate, something unexpected happened. Emma was working on a puzzle, one of those oversized foam floor types with jungle animals and winding paths. She struggled with one of the corner pieces, trying to make it fit. Amber, Allison's eldest, walked over. For a split second, I braced myself for the familiar sigh, the dismissive comment. But instead, Amber knelt beside her and said, "I think that piece goes in the opposite corner. Want help?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. They worked together quietly, patiently. When Melissa made a teasing comment about Emma's sparkly shoes, Allison was quick to step in. "Melissa," she said firmly, "that comment wasn't kind. Please apologize." Melissa blinked, clearly unused to being corrected in front of others. But after a moment she said, "Sorry, Emma. It wasn't perfect. But it was progress." Later in the car, Emma turned to me and said, "Aunt Allison said the same thing you always say. That we don't have to be mean to feel big." I smiled. "Sounds like she's learning too." Emma nodded. "Maybe we're all learning." There was a stillness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not the kind of stillness that comes from silence or exhaustion, but something else, something deeper. A quiet hum of alignment, of knowing that for once I was living in a way that honored both myself and the people I loved. It took me years to reach this place. Years of swallowing discomfort. Years of believing that love was earned through sacrifice. That if I gave more, tolerated more, bent more, I'd finally be enough. But enough isn't something you become through suffering. It's something you decide you already are. One Thursday afternoon, I stayed after Emma's therapy session to speak with Dr. Bennett privately. She gestured for me to sit her office full of warm-toned pillows and soft lamplight. "She's doing beautifully," she said. "Her self-confidence has grown noticeably. And she's beginning to articulate her needs without fear." I nodded, emotion catching in my throat. That was the part I didn't realize I'd passed down. The fear. Dr. Bennett offered a kind smile. "You stopped it. That's what matters." "I didn't think I could," I admitted. "There were so many years where I thought if I just worked harder, gave more, they'd love me the way I needed. But nothing changed." "Until you changed," she said. And that was the truth of it. The real shift hadn't come from their apologies or therapy sessions or awkward attempts at reconnecting. It had come from me. From the moment I said no. From the day I told them, "You don't get to mistreat my child and expect me to fund it." From the quiet refusal to participate in the narrative that had shaped my childhood. That love required submission, that family came before self-respect, that peace only came through pleasing others. One night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she curled against me and asked, "Do you think people can really change?" I looked down at her hair still damp from her bath, her voice small but steady. "Yes," I said, "I think they can. But not just because we want them to. They have to want it too." She nodded, thoughtful. "Grandma and Grandpa are different," she said slowly. "Not all the way, but a little." I smiled. "That's how it starts. A little." She traced the edge of her blanket. "I used to think they didn't like me, like I was broken." I froze, the ache rising in my throat again. "But now," she added, "I think maybe they didn't know how to be kind. Not really. And maybe they're learning." I pulled her close. "You are not broken, Emma. You never were. And you never have to earn love. Ever. Even if I mess up. Especially then." She was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "I think they're trying." "So do I." Later that night, I sat on the balcony outside our apartment, a blanket around my shoulders, and a cup of tea in hand. The city below hummed with life. Distant sirens, the murmur of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. And I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who cleaned the kitchen spotless just to hear. Could have done better. The one who cried silently after being compared to her sister. The one who boarded a bus alone to college carrying more pressure than luggage. I wanted to tell her something. That she didn't fail. That she wasn't weak for wanting love. That her strength didn't come from how much she could endure, but from the moment she chose to stop enduring it. And I wanted her to know we broke the cycle. Emma would grow up knowing that mistakes were part of learning, not shame. That love was a constant, not a currency. That she could say no, and still belong. I breathed in the crisp air and felt tears gather. Not from grief, but from release. The next weekend we met my parents again. A short visit. Still supervised. But this time Emma brought her sketch pad. She drew a butterfly, its wings mid-flight, and when my father leaned over and said, "That's really good," she beamed. Not because he approved, but because she believed it already, and his words were just an echo. On the way home she asked, "Is it okay that I love them again?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes, sweetheart. It's more than okay. But they were mean before." "Yes. And they're working on being better now. Loving them doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you're brave." She nodded, satisfied. And I realized she wasn't just healing. She was learning how to forgive without losing herself. That night as I lay in bed, I felt it again. That stillness. Not perfection, not closure, but peace. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for others to change and choose to change what you allow. The kind that says, "This is enough. We are enough." It had been 1 full year since that afternoon in my parents' kitchen, since I walked in and found my daughter trembling over a sink of soapy dishes, while voices that once shaped my childhood tore into hers. And now, here we were, in our apartment, just me and Emma, preparing for her 7th birthday party. It wasn't grand. There were no clowns, no expensive decorations, no Instagram-worthy backdrops, just paper lanterns, a tablecloth. Emma picked out with stars on it, and a playlist of her favorite songs humming softly in the background. The smell of vanilla cupcakes filled the space. I was stirring the lemonade when the doorbell rang. Emma peeked out the window. "Grandma and Grandpa are here," she whispered, her voice even, neither excited nor afraid, just calm. I opened the door and greeted them with a quiet smile. My mother held a carefully wrapped box. My father gave a soft nod. "Happy birthday, sweet girl," my mom said gently as she leaned down to hug Emma, who accepted it without flinching. "We brought something we thought you'd like," she added, handing Emma the box. Emma unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a hardcover book titled Wonders of the Natural World, filled with real photos of animals, insects, and planets. She gasped, flipping through the pages. "This is so cool. It's got frogs in it," my father said, "and a whole section on butterflies." Emma's eyes lit up. "Thank you." She didn't run off. She didn't hide behind me. She simply placed the book on the table and went back to arranging her puzzle. Progress, I thought. Not perfection, but something solid, something earned. A few minutes later, Allison arrived with Amber and Melissa. I could tell she was nervous, adjusting the strap of her purse twice before stepping in. But when Emma greeted her cousins with a smile and the girls responded with genuine cheer, I saw her shoulders drop in relief. There were no comments about clothes or snacks, no subtle digs or comparisons, just three girls on the floor with markers and stickers giggling over how to design birthday crowns. The living room was full but peaceful, chatter flowing gently, no sharp edges. At one point, I caught my father kneeling beside Emma, listening intently as she explained how frogs breathe through their skin. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He nodded, absorbing her words like they were gospel. My mother offered to help serve cake. When she dropped a napkin and Emma reached down to pick it up, she said, "Oh, I've got it, honey. You don't have to clean up today. It's your birthday." A year ago, that sentence would have been unthinkable. When it came time to blow out the candles, Emma stood at the head of the table, 7 little flames flickering before her. I looked around the room, at the people who had caused pain, who were now learning to make amends. At my sister, who was unlearning generational scripts and rewriting how she mothered. At Emma, confident, silly, messy, joyful, a child allowed to be. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was performing a version of family. I felt like I was living it. Emma made her wish and blew out the candles. Everyone clapped. No one made jokes about her form or her posture, or if she'd done it right. She turned to me and whispered, "I didn't wish for anything big, just to stay like this." I smiled, heartful. "That's a beautiful wish." After the guests left, we curled up together on the couch, her fingers still sticky from frosting. "Mommy," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Is it okay that I love them again? Even though they were mean before?" Her question held no guilt, only curiosity. I ran my fingers through her hair and said, "Yes, sweetheart. People can make mistakes, even big ones. What matters is they try to change, and that you always know what love should feel like." She leaned into me. "I think they're really trying now." "I think so too." She yawned, settling her head on my lap. "I'm glad you stood up for me." I kissed her forehead. "Me too, baby. Me too." Later that night, after she was fast asleep, I stood alone in the kitchen. The same kind of kitchen where so much had unraveled 1 year ago, but this one felt different. It didn't echo with fear or sharp memories. It was quiet, warm, full of potential. I thought back to the moment I canceled that mortgage payment. It had felt like rebellion, like risk, like turning away from a lifetime of duty. But now I saw it more clearly. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about realignment, about protecting what mattered most, Emma's heart and my own. It was about saying no more. No more financial guilt masquerading as love. No more loyalty at the cost of self-worth. No more silence in the face of harm. What bloomed in its place wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that honesty made room for healing, for change, for love that didn't ask us to shrink in order to fit. As I turned off the kitchen light and walked quietly to bed, I whispered to myself, "This is what freedom feels like. Not flashy, not loud, just earned, one boundary at a time." Sometimes protecting those we love means making hard choices, especially when it comes to family. I didn't expect standing up for my daughter would also mean breaking free from a lifetime of quiet pain, but in doing so, I found something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Have you ever had to draw a boundary with someone you love even when it hurt? How did you find the strength to choose what was right over what was easy? If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and your stories matter too. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more stories like this. Real voices, real heartbreaks, and real healing. Thank you for listening. Stay strong and never forget, you deserve respect, love, and peace, just as you are.